The millionaire had invited the waitress and her boy to his party for fun, but when she touched the piano, Jonathan Blackwell was at his penthouse suite window, staring at the expansive glittering New York skyline. By 45 he owned everything money could buy, a hedge fund that people whispered was among the best, real estate around the world, and forged friendships with the city's elite. But as he thought about his approaching birthday, he felt an unnameable emptiness. His perfectly tailored suit could not disguise the weary steel-gray ticker of his eyes or the lines around his mouth, not frowning but years of practiced false smiles. Jonathan was the consummate charmer and networker. He could charm the pants off anyone at any bar, but he lacked true friends. As he turned from the window, his gaze caught the invitation to his own birthday gala, a lavish party at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The names on the guest list read like a lineup of New York society, hand-picked party guests selected for their influence or net worth. Jonathan sighed, preparing himself for the forced pleasantries and subtle exchanges of lucrative career opportunities that would soon take over the night. It was a random rash decision. He would have breakfast in a small diner near his office, somewhere he'd passed 65 times in 65 days but never visited. The bright jingle of bells greeted him as he opened the door. "Welcome to Rosie's. Sit where you are," Han, a warm voice called. Jonathan looked up to see a woman in her late 30s, her auburn hair in a messy bun, smile lines crinkling around her bright green eyes. Her name tag read Lucy. Jonathan drifted into easy conversation as Lucy poured his coffee. It was refreshing. No facade, no agenda, just human beings connecting. He found out that Lucy was a single mom, juggling 2 jobs to raise her 10-year-old son Max. "He's such a little pianist," Lucy said proudly, and pulled up a video on her phone of a little boy playing a difficult piece on an old upright piano. Jonathan was about to leave when he made the life-altering decision. "Lucy," he said as he pulled his birthday invitation from his pocket. "I'm throwing a party this Saturday. Why don't you and Max come?" Lucy looked at him in shock. "Oh, that's so nice, but we couldn't. I insist." Jonathan interrupted, surprising himself with his sincerity. "It would be nice to have some actual people out there." As he stepped out of the diner, invitation lingering on the counter, Jonathan caught a tinge of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He had no inkling that this genuine impulse would be the catalyst for a realization that would rock the very walls of his meticulously built universe. The evening of Jonathan's birthday gala arrived, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art was made over into a dazzling wonderland of champagne fountains and ice sculptures. Dressed in designer gowns and impeccably tailored tuxedos, the city's elite mingled, their laughter ringing through the grand halls. At the door, Jonathan stood, greeting guests with rote cordiality. But his eyes kept scanning the door, looking for Lucy and Max. When evening descended, he started to lose hope that they were coming. Just at the moment when he was ready to give up, he saw them. In a simple, non-designer black dress, Lucy looked lovely, elegante. Next to her, Max squirmed in a twilight-tinted suit a bit too big for him, taking in the gilded surroundings with eyes the size of saucers. "Lucy, Max, you made it," Jonathan said with real pleasure. As he drew closer to the table, he was aware of glances from nearby guests, curious and disapproving. Lucy smiled nervously. "Thank you for having us, Mr. Blackwell. So all that is to say that it's just all a bit overwhelming." "Call me Jonathan," he insisted, ushering them deeper into the party. "And don't worry, just be yourselves. Believe me, it's fresh around this place." While they navigated through the crowd, Jonathan introduced Lucy and Max to different guests. Some were gracious but not interested, while the others did not even pretend to hide their disdain at the presence of a waitress among guests at such an exclusive event. Max, meanwhile, appeared blissfully ignorant of the social currents swirling around. His gaze was directed toward the grand piano in the corner of the room, which was now being used as a prop for a floral arrangement. "Mom, check it out," he whispered breathlessly. "Steinway, just like in the videos you showed me." Lucy pressed his hand. "I think I see it, honey, but we can't touch it. It's just for decoration." Jonathan eavesdropped on the exchange and felt sad. There was a child who had real heart and potential, and the piano was being treated like a fancy table. Jonathan became increasingly aware as the night went on that he preferred the company of Lucy and Max to the ones he usually kept. It was refreshing to be in the presence of their unfiltered responses to the art and the thrill of being in such a big place. But not everyone was as grateful as Jonathan for his unusual guests. He picked up half-heard snatches of dialogue, whispered verdicts about gatecrashers and charity cases. Against the backdrop of the strategic turmoil, Jonathan's situation reached its zenith when Evelyn Hartley, a powerful socialite and one of Jonathan's biggest investors, came to him with a glass of champagne and a saccharine grin. "Jonathan, darling," she drawled, false sweetness oozing from her voice. "Your little project is indeed making waves, but don't you think it's time to stop the social experiment? We have serious matters to discuss after all." Before he could reply, though, he saw Max pull on Lucy's sleeve and point insistently at the piano. And at that instant, Jonathan decided to do something that would change the evening, and his life. "Actually, Evelyn," he said, his voice ringing out over the now quiet room, "I think we need a little levity here." He knelt beside Max, looking him in the eye. "Max, are you going to play us something?" There the boy's eyes hung on to the above, but Lucy jumped in embarrassed. "Oh no, we couldn't possibly." "Please," Jonathan insisted. "I'd love to hear Max play. Treat it as a birthday gift to me." Lucy hesitated for a moment. Then she nodded. As Jonathan walked them to the piano, he could feel the heaviness of each eye in the room. They opened up, a strange mix of curious and disdain barely unmasked on their faces. Max was at the piano, his tiny body swallowed by the wonderful instrument. He shut his eyes, inhaled deeply, and started to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major came to the ear, silencing every whisper, every clink of champagne glasses. He was young, but the boy's fluid, emotional fingers moving across the keys seemed almost impossible. As the exquisite melody filled the silent crowd, Jonathan looked at Lucy. What he saw caught his breath in his throat. Lucy wasn't watching Max. Her gaze was trained on the piano itself, a mix of deep recognition and long-buried hurt written on her features. And in that moment, Jonathan knew the story behind Lucy was incomprehensibly deeper than he could ever imagine. And while Max's music continued to enchant the immobilized guests, Jonathan knew this was the moment his life would change, and that a waitress's life and her immensely talented son's life forever. With Max's fingers flying over the keys, Jonathan's gaze caught Lucy. Her expression was one of conflicting emotions. Pride in her son's performance, sure, but a deep, haunting sorrow that seemed to transcend the music. And when the last notes trailed off, the room applauded. Max smiled, reveling in the attention, while Lucy stood paralyzed with her eyes glued to the piano. Jonathan reached out and touched her arm. "Lucy, are you all right?" She jumped as if coming out of a trance. Yes, it's just this piano. I know this piano." Just before Jonathan could ask her to clarify her point, they were mobbed by other guests, all clamoring to congratulate his son on his amazing feat. As the crowd dispersed, one lone figure approached, an old man, his gaze locked on Lucy. It was Arthur Steinway, the head of the famous piano-making family. "Pardon us," Arthur murmured with a voice shaking with bravery. "But you bear an uncanny resemblance to someone I once knew, a genius pianist called Elizabeth Caldwell. Any relation?" Lucy's face paled. She said, "Elizabeth was my mother." Arthur's eyes widened. "Good heavens. Then you must be little Lucy. After all, I never thought I would see you again." "Well, after what happened?" Judging Jonathan's confused look between them, "You. Sorry, but what the hell is happening here?" Lucy inhaled, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. "This piano. It was my mother's. She was an internationally renowned concert pianist. This exact instrument was made for her by Steinway and Sons." Arthur nodded solemnly. "Elizabeth Caldwell was a prodigy, one of her generation's greatest talents. But she vanished at the peak of her powers, immediately after a concert at Carnegie Hall. No one knew what happened to her or the piano." The sound of Lucy's voice was rasping. She couldn't take the pressure, the constant touring, the demands of her profession. It was too much. She gave up everything, her fame, her fortune. "This piano. She changed our names and we began our lives again." To Jonathan, it was as though the ground was moving under him. The waitress he had whimsically invited, the woman he had stupidly believed he was improving, was actually the daughter of a famous concert pianist, an almost truly entitled scion of generations of musical genius. "But how did the piano get all the way here?" he said, still processing this revelation. Arthur shook his head sadly. "It was sold years back at auction. We had no idea it was here to think all this time." As the implications of this discovery started to sink in, Jonathan noticed Max, who had been intently listening to the conversation. The boy's eyes were filled with awe and a newly achieved comprehension of his own exceptional ability. Lucy lowered next to her son, tears now streaming down her face. "Max, darling, I am so sorry I never told you about your grandmother. I thought I was shielding you from the pressures that shattered her, but I've come to recognize that the music is part of who you are, who we are." Jonathan felt like an intruder in this moment of grief between mother and son, but he was also filled with awe at the part he had unexpectedly played in reuniting the family with their lost heritage. Soon news would spread through the party with the speed of light, changing the course of their own lives. But at that moment, with the small family gathered in the living room and holding on to one another in front of the piano that had given them so much history, Jonathan knew he had been given the greatest birthday gift of all. The opportunity to observe a long-concealed truth be revealed, and along with it, the start of an incredible new chapter in the history of Lucy and Max Caldwell. As the evening stretched into the night and the party started to fizzle out, Jonathan buzzed with activity. Word had spread quickly about Lucy and Max's connection to the legendary Elizabeth Caldwell, putting a waitress and her son from just outside Chicago squarely in the center of the stage. At the party, music critics were already anointing Max the new Caldwell, while collectors and museum curators gossiped about the discovery of Elizabeth's dusty, long-lost Steinway. Among it all, Lucy has the look of being overwhelmed, expounding pride and a son that is newly noticed, and anxiety over the abrupt exposure of their past. Jonathan soaked all of it in with a swirl of feelings. He was filled with that kind of joy you get at having played a role in this miraculous reunion, but also a creeping guilt. Had he inadvertently put Lucy and Max in the spotlight at a time when they weren't ready for it? As the last guests departed, Jonathan made a choice that would change Lucy and Max's lives and his own. He found Lucy at the piano with Max, lightly brushing her fingers across the keys. "Lucy," he said softly, "can we talk for a moment?" She raised her head, her eyes at once thankful and fearful. "Jonathan, of course, I don't even know how to thank you for tonight, for everything." Jonathan shook his head. "You don't have to thank me, but I would like to make you an offer." He paused and took a deep breath. "I want to start a foundation in Max's name. These scholarships will sustain his musical education, preserve your mother's rich legacy, and help other gifted young musicians who may not have the economic wherewithal to pursue their own dreams." Lucy's eyes widened in shock. "Jonathan, that is more than generous, but we couldn't possibly accept." "Please," Jonathan cut in gently. "This isn't charity. It's an investment in talent, it's an investment in the future of music, and it's how I want to spend my money. I want to do something good with my money. Something more than a matter of making more money." Behind the wheels, Jonathan saw Lucy's face as she grappled with his offer. Accepting would mean returning to a world she had purposefully escaped, and subjecting Max to the same pressures that shattered her own mother. But to refuse would deny her son the chance to fully explore his brilliant gift. Finally, Lucy glanced up at Jonathan, a decision sealed. "All right," she said softly. "We accept, for Max, for my mother's legacy." The impact of this decision was immediate and widespread. The following weeks were whirlwind busy. Jonathan's brigade of lawyers and financial advisors were hard at work establishing the Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation for Musical Excellence. Max had been accepted into a prestigious music conservatory, and being such a gifted musician, began studying with some of the best and most expensive teachers in the world. With Jonathan supportive, Lucy began to reconnect with her own musical roots, performing even at small local venues. The story became a media epiphany, a Broadway fairy tale, dubbed the Diner to Carnegie Hall fairy tale. There were television appearances, magazine covers, and even talks of a Hollywood biopic. For Jonathan, the stakes were just as high. The foundation was a source of mixed reactions in his business circle. Some lauded his philanthropy and framed it as a savvy PR strategy. Others, including Evelyn Hartley, were not as impressed. "Yeah, Jonathan," she said during one tense meeting, "I hope you know what you're doing. Charity is all well and good. But this is turning into an obsession. Never forget who you should serve your first loyalty to." But Jonathan noticed he increasingly cared less about the thoughts of people like Evelyn. For the first time in recounted the years, he felt the hope of purpose beyond having more money. Morgan went into work at the foundation and found his passion in developing young talent, something he never knew was in him. His bond with Lucy and Max grew to be more than benefactor and beneficiaries. True friends. He began looking forward to their weekly dinners, where Max would be excitedly sharing what he was working on musically, and Lucy would tell Max stories about her mother's career that she was slowly starting to put pieces together. As the months went on, Jonathan had come to realize that his hasty decision to invite a waitress and her son to his birthday party hadn't only altered their lives. It had permanently changed his own. Until, over the years, that emptiness he had seen looking out at the New York skyline on that night, during which he felt as if he had been missing something, was slowly filling itself with something he hadn't even realized he needed so badly. A real human connection and the opportunity to actually make a difference in the world. The way forward was tumultuous, rife with tremendous opportunities and terrifying challenges. But as Jonathan sat back and watched Max step up to the stage for his first public recital, Lucy beaming from the front row, he realized that no matter what was in store for them next, it would be a journey to remember. While Jonathan, Lucy and Max were grappling with their new reality, a second drama was playing out behind the scenes. Arthur Steinway, stirred by the rediscovery of Elizabeth Caldwell's piano and the rise of her grandson's talent, had started to do a deep dive of the company archives. What he revealed was a buried scandal that could not only tarnish the Steinway name, but the classical music establishment as a whole. Buried in a file of dust, Arthur discovered a correspondence between his father, then head of Steinway and Sons, and Elizabeth Caldwell's manager, accosting a pattern of exploitation and control. Elizabeth, it appeared, had driven herself to the edge by crisscrossing the country on punishing tour schedules, by selling herself for profit. Her disappearance had not been a mystery. It was a forlorn escape from a life that had become unbearable. Arthur was torn. Summoning this information would enable Lucy to close a dark chapter of her family tree and affirm her mother's life decisions. But it would not only expose decades of unethical practices in the industry, it would potentially tarnish the reputations of Steinway and many other key figures in the classical music world. As Arthur wrestled with its moral implications, Evelyn Hartley, another player, still feeling burned by Jonathan's betrayal of their social circle, made her entrance. Had started digging into Lucy's history. She engaged a private investigator, vowing to find something, anything, to undermine the waitress-turned-heiress and by extension Jonathan's judgment. Unbeknown to Evelyn, her investigation was about to intersect with Arthur's discovery in a way that would shake the foundations of New York's high society and the classical music world. Lucy, however, was fighting a different battle within herself. As Max became a star and the weight of expectation mounted, she was forced to relive her mother's tragedy. She was seeing the same signs of stress and anxiety in Max as she remembered seeing in her mother years before. One night after one of Lucy's now routine grueling practice sessions, Lucy found Max sobbing in his room. "I don't want to let everybody down," he cried. "But sometimes I just want to be a regular kid." Lucy's heart broke. In trying to nurture Max's gift, she had unwittingly embarked on a path that had led her mother to ruin. Nora knew she needed to change, but that would mean facing Jonathan about how he was ruining everything he had worked hard for. A confrontation was brewing, one that would challenge everyone involved to grapple with hard truths about ambition, ethics, and the price of success as these disparate threads started to intersect. Weighing heavy under his family history of transgression, Arthur Steinway was getting ready to approach with his truth. Evelyn Hartley, who had come equipped with what she considered fire-breathing evidence of Lucy's sordid past, was prepared to mount a social assault. And Lucy, feeling conflicted between protecting her son and keeping her obligations, was about to make a decision that would change the trajectory of their lives forever. Jonathan, riding his philanthropy high, didn't know the world was coming to judge him, only to make mistakes, have to confront unforeseen effects of his benevolent actions, and make choices that would test both his budding search for purpose and the newly nurtured connections he had with Lucy and Max. The fairy tale that had enthralled the public was about to learn its most brutal lesson in reality. And whether this particular fairy tale made it had to do with which agency each player took in this twisting, interlapping real-life drama. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, but the ties between Jonathan and Lucy, Max and Lucy, Jonathan and Max, evolved in ways no one could reasonably foresee. What started as a chance encounter between a millionaire and a waitress turned into something much deeper and more complex than an easy label could ever suggest. Jonathan began to find himself in the company of Lucy and Max less and less out of his duty towards the foundation, and more out of a desire to spend time with them. He found new pleasure in simple things he had long neglected. and movie nights with Max, whose observations about film scores showed the boy a new way to experience cinema. Whispers in silence with Lucy over coffee about music theory and philosophy. For Lucy it was a more complicated journey. Max was and always would be the light of her life, and she was genuinely thankful to Jonathan for everything he had done to give him the chances he was now traveling the world to enjoy. And yet Alice was also battling feelings of being dependent on others. Sometimes she caught herself wondering whether their friendship was real or just another of Jonathan's charity projects. These doubts coalesced one evening following a foundation event. When Jonathan was driving them home, Lucy had suddenly said, "You don't have to do this, you know." Jonathan looked at her, puzzled. "Do what?" "This, Lucy." Lucy waved her hand vaguely, "Being with us, pretending we're friends. Thank you for all you did, but I don't want you to feel like you have to." Jonathan pulled off the road, turning to look squarely at Lucy. "Is that what you think this is? Obligation?" His voice was gentle, pain in his tone. "Lucy, you and Max, you've given me more than I could ever give you. For the first time in years, I'm part of something real, something meaningful." Lucy was so struck by Jonathan's admission of vulnerability. She understood that as wealthy and influential as Jonathan was, he had been just as lonely, in just as much need of authentic connection as she had. From that point on, their relationship evolved. The formalities and expected thanks fell away, and we became true friends, grateful for each other instead. Max, for his part, was only getting closer to Jonathan. The boy had started to view him as a parental figure. Jonathan became an unexpected mentor, not only encouraging Max's passion and providing the necessary financial backing, but also helping him navigate the complexity of the fame that came with it. One especially heartbreaking moment was after Max's first major public debut. The boy had played beautifully, but Jonathan found him backstage in tears. "What's wrong, Max?" He crouched down beside him and asked. "You are amazing out there." Max raised his eyes, conflicted. "I was thinking of Grandma Elizabeth, that she escaped all this. What if I also am not strong enough?" Jonathan had a sudden instinct to protect. "Max, listen to me. Your grandma made the decision she felt was in her best interest and the best interest of your mom, but your road is your road. Whatever you decide, we're all here for you. The music is a gift, but it doesn't define you." As he enfolded Max, Jonathan met Lucy's glance. She was standing by the door watching them, tears running down her cheek. At that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. They were no longer simply benefactor and recipients or even simply friends. They'd formed a family, connected by something beyond blood or paper. This change in their dynamics did not escape external observation. Tabloids started speculating on just what kind of relationship Jonathan and Lucy had, and some of Jonathan's friends whispered about the gold-digging waitress who'd snagged the eligible bachelor. But for Jonathan, Lucy, and Max, those outside views held less and less weight. As they navigated the struggles of Max's fledgling career, they had each become for the other the sense of belonging and understanding which had been absent in their lives for so long. Despite the pressures of the foundation and their own personal growth, they grew together. They were not three people randomly thrown together by circumstances. They were a unit helping each other through every high and low. What they didn't know was that this new family connection was soon to be challenged in ways they could never have imagined. So it was that event, and the day when the secrets of the past and the machinations of those who felt threatened by their happiness collided in a perfect storm from the skies above, all while the annual gala for the Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation was underway. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Grand Ballroom, the exact spot where it had all started a year ago, was filled with the music world's elite, along with philanthropists and society figures. Jonathan, Lucy, and Max huddled together near the stage. A solidarity as they all set up for the night's main event, a performance by Max on the newly restored Steinway, which was now the focal point of the foundation's endeavors. A silence descended as Max sat at the piano. But just as he was about to start, Evelyn Hartley's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "So before we continue, ladies and gentlemen, there's something you all need to know about our hosts." Then everyone turned to Evelyn, who stood at the back of the room, a triumphant smile on her face. Lucy stiffened, instinctively sliding closer to Max. "Poor Jonathan has been duped," Evelyn went on. "The woman," she pointed at Lucy, "should not say, is not who she claims to be. I have evidence that she's been lying about her identity, her past, and her mother's legacy." A murmur passed through the crowd. Jonathan stepped forward, his face taut with anger. "Evelyn, not the time or the place. But he was interrupted by another voice, this one near the piano. It was Arthur Steinway, pale but determined. "If we're telling truths tonight," his voice trembling, he added. "And then there's something else that has to be said." He took some old letters out of his jacket. "These letters show that my family and other people in the music business applied the pressure that drove Elizabeth Caldwell away. We used her talent, took her to the limit. All for our own gain." The room erupted into chaos. Reporters covering the event shouted questions. Society types were hissing angrily among themselves. Through it all, Lucy was frozen, her gaze fixed on Max, who was closely beginning to fear. As Jonathan watched everything spiral out of control, he made the split-second decision. His presence alone silenced the room as he marched to center stage. "Yes, there have been secrets," he said, his voice steady and crisp. "But tonight is not about the past. It's about the future. It's about a boy with an extraordinary gift and a family that's fought so very hard to be here tonight." He faced Lucy, his hand outstretched. "Lucy, I think there's something you want to say." Lucy paused briefly, then inhaled and strode forward. "My name is Lucy Caldwell," she started, her voice gaining strength with every word. "I am the daughter of Elizabeth Caldwell. For years, I hid from that truth, wanting to spare my son from the pressures that shattered my mother. But I've come to understand that by doing so, I've been denying a part of who we are." She stepped over to the piano, her hand on Max's shoulder. "The music is in our blood. A gift, yes, with a little bit of a burden. And all thanks to Jonathan and this foundation. And if so, we have an opportunity to leverage it for others, to create a different way of doing business in the industry." All eyes were on Lucy and Max, and the room had fallen into silence. Jonathan looked at the family around him, and in that instant he felt a wave of pride and love for this family that had changed his life. Max glanced at his mother, then at the crowd. Without a word, he went to the piano and began to play. That melody which was echoing in the room was a haunting good composition that Lucy Little well recognized as her mother's unfinished symphony. But as the music built, Jonathan noticed Lucy had tears in her eyes. He came to stand beside her and took her hand in his. And so they stayed side by side, watching as Max's music slowly started to heal the wounds that had been opened, ushering a new dawn from the ruins of the past. The climactic revelations had not ruined them as their enemies had wished. Instead, it had allowed them to face the past in the light of day, and flush with the fact that they were somehow stronger and more united than ever. The days that followed the gala became a media frenzy for Jonathan, Lucy, and Max. Goosebumps, soul-tingling as three words echoed through the chambers of Claire's mind, etching themselves into the very fabric of her being: fuck, power, money. Jonathan's PR team was working overtime in an effort to control the narrative, but it was already becoming clear to him that his only path ahead was through absolute transparency. He summoned a press conference with Lucy and Arthur Steinway at his side. "We are here today to discuss the events of the Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation Gala," Jonathan began, his voice unwavering. "But we're here to talk about the future more importantly." Lucy stepped up, holding her head high. "Yes, I cloaked myself for years. I felt afraid of what had broken my mother, afraid of what that legacy meant for my son. I've learned, though, that running away from the past solves nothing. We just have to confront it, take lessons from it, and allow it to bring about positive change." Next to speak was Arthur Steinway, appearing older and more fragile than ever. But the Steinway family and many other industry figures must also accept responsibility for a tradition of harsh conditions that drove talents like Elizabeth Caldwell to the brink. "Past can't be changed, but we can make sure it doesn't repeat." Jonathan then laid out a slew of initiatives. The Review, an independent review of industry practices, mental health support for young musicians, and a commitment to ethical talent development. The Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation will pave the way for a more supportive, sustainable climate for artists, he said. The press conference was a gamble, but it was a winning one. Their honesty and insistence on change resonated well with the public. But not everyone was so quickly smitten. In high society, Evelyn Hartley and her companions on the quest for answers were, unbeknownst to them, the subjects of whispers about scandal and deception. Yes, a few business partners of Jonathan's raised their eyebrows at his judgment, wondering if Lucy and Max had clouded Jonathan's financial patterns. Lucy too faced challenges. In classical music circles, some accused her of coattail riding and questioned her talents and motivations. And Max, who is young, was not also immune to criticism, as some claimed his powers are being inflated at any cost to play for publicity. Through all of this, Jonathan, Lucy, and Max sat together, huddled together like bonds cemented through adversity. They had long, frank talks about their fears, their hopes, and their commitment to one another and the Foundation's mission. One evening, after yet another relentless day of meetings and interviews, while they sat in Jonathan's penthouse, Max floored them both. "I want to stop performing," he said penitently. "Just for a little while. I like the music, but I don't know, I think I want to be a kid for a while." Lucy and Jonathan looked at each other, a worried but relieved look in their eyes. "Of course, dear," Lucy said, hugging Max. "Whatever you ask," Jonathan nodded his head in affirmation. "The music will always be there, Max. What's most important is taking care of yourself." When this decision was announced, the reactions were mixed. Some congratulated them for prioritizing Max's well-being, while others accused them of squandering his talent. But for Jonathan, Lucy, and Max, it was a watershed moment. It was in that moment they understood their power was not about how they felt the world should react, against all the steamrolled expectations of society above what they had and their devotion to each other. Over the next few weeks, they would work tirelessly to win back public trust, to win over the music industry, and to win over each other. Lucy started to discover her own music skills. Not fearful of comparisons to his mother, Jonathan rolled up his sleeves and focused on reforming the practices of his business, fueled by the high standards of ethics they were establishing at the Foundation. Gradually, their efforts started to pay off. Real changes were happening in the industry as a result of the Foundation's newly minted initiatives. Stories from young musicians and their families started flooding in of how the reformed practices had touched their lives positively. Realizing a new level of moral integrity in Jonathan, even some of Jonathan's business associates were starting to see the value in a more ethical approach. The ranks of people surrounding Evelyn Hartley and her supporters grew thinner as the ranks around Jonathan's vision grew thicker. Inspired by the work of the Foundation, Arthur Steinway initiated a campaign within his own company to right historical wrongs and help create a more artist-friendly business model. When the dust started to settle, Jonathan, Lucy, and Max were at a chapter of their lives. The road ahead was still murky, fraught with hurdles and possible landmines. But this time they faced it together, no longer a millionaire, a waitress, and a prodigy brought together by chance, but a family bound by love, common purpose, and the transformative power of music. The conflict remained unresolved. There would always be those who questioned, who doubted, but in their effort to confront it directly with honesty and integrity, they had sown the seeds for enduring, constructive change. When they looked to the future, they weren't terrified, they were hopeful and resolute. 6 months after the fraught gala, Jonathan stood on the stage of a small community center in Brooklyn. Instead, the audience was filled not with movie stars or rich benefactors, but with children from less prosperous families, all excited to learn about music. "Welcome to Jonathan," declared the first Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation music camp, his face radiating with sincere joy. "Over the next 2 weeks, you will have the opportunity to try out different instruments, learn about different musical styles, and of course find the fun in making what you can of music." This camp was the first of its kind for the Foundation. Rather than cater just to nurturing prodigies or preserving classical music traditions, they had broadened their mission to make music education available to all children. No matter who they are and if they are talented or not, Lucy observed Jonathan from the back of the room and was proud to observe him with the children. He was in his element, his usual corporate demeanor, fleeting and almost childlike. Max was there too, not a performer but a peer mentor. At 13, he strayed among the younger children, encouraging them and imparting his love of music without the pressure of public performance. This different path had not come easily. It had meant an entire reconsideration of the Foundation's aims, and of Jonathan's own notions of success and impact. But as he saw the children's eyes sparkle at the sound of a perfectly struck piano key or the blast of a trumpet, he felt they had made the right choice. The breakthrough had actually come months earlier, during a late-night conversation with Lucy. What if, she had wondered, we could give every child the ability to self-reflect on some level, to fall in love with music the way Max fell in love with music, not to create stars but to make their own lives richer? That one simple question initiated a revolution in their approach. They had turned their focus from concert halls to classrooms, from child prodigies to music educators. Now the Foundation supplied instruments to underfunded schools, supported after-school music programs, and publicized scholarships for music therapy. As the camp session took off in earnest, "GD forbid you should try to read during this time." The sounds of stirring notes and delighted giggles filled the air. Jonathan felt the sense of fulfillment that eluded him all his years at work. He locked eyes with Lucy across the room. They smiled, a wordless exchange of understanding. This was more than just a new direction for the foundation. It was the next chapter in their lives, where success was not measured in dollars earned or awards received but in lives changed, both of their own and those of individuals they met at shows, and the joy of music shared. When Jonathan had turned toward the rapturous faces of the children, he had known the journey that had begun with an offhand invitation offered to a waitress and her son was only beginning. But he was looking forward to an uncertain future for the first time in his life. Prepared to counter whatever obstacles lay in front, with Lucy and Max at his side. When the Elizabeth Caldwell Foundation Music Camp ended, Jonathan sat on the tiny community center stage, long after the final child had departed. The room had a great vibe for reflection, still crackling with the spirits of infectious music making. He reflected on the man he had been only a year and a half earlier, the one who had succeeded by every conventional measure. But highly unsatisfying, the old Jonathan would have balked at the prospect of spending 2 weeks teaching inner-city kids basic piano. Now he couldn't think of anything more gratifying. His maturation hadn't just been reflected in his priorities and values. Jonathan discovered that he had grown as a person in ways he'd never imagined. He had learned to be vulnerable, to connect with people. All the walls he'd built around himself over years working in the cutthroat world of business had shattered, replaced now by an openness and empathy he'd never before considered. There was no denying Lucy's influence on this transformation. The strength, resilience, and willingness to forgive had shown Jonathan a new path through the vicissitudes of life. He had learned from her that real strength is often found in acknowledging what was wrestling with him and confronting it directly. As if conjured by his thoughts, Lucy stood in the doorway. "There you are," she said gently, sitting down next to him. "Penny for your thoughts." Jonathan smiled and took her hand in his. "I was just reflecting on how much has changed, how much I've changed." Lucy nodded, the understanding in her eyes. "You're not the only one. I look at myself today and I can barely recognize the woman so terrified of her own past, so terrified of allowing Max access to his heritage." They stayed quiet for a moment, both thinking about their journey. "You know," Jonathan said after a long pause, "I used to think growth was always about getting more wealth, more power, more status. But now I understand that it's often more about releasing preconceptions, releasing fear, releasing the desire to control everything." Lucy squeezed his hand. "That's lovely, Jonathan, and so true." Max interrupted their moment of contemplation, pounding into the room like he always does. "Mom, Jonathan, you've got to see this. I've been composing something new influenced by the children at the camp." Jonathan and Lucy glanced at each other as Max sat at the piano and started to play. The music was beautiful, but what impressed them most was the joy on Max's face. He was playing not for glory nor because he had to, but because he loved it. Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his throat. Max too had grown so much. The pressure and anxiety that once seemed to fester him had turned into an earnest, stable devotion to music. When the last notes faded away, Jonathan realized that this moment of shared joy, of music freely given and received, was what true wealth felt like. The boy's tears on a New York street corner had triggered a chain of events that not only changed lives, his and many others, but also taught them all what real success and fulfillment were. Seemingly reading his thoughts, Lucy rested her head on his shoulder. "Who knew," she said, "that one little chance encounter could lead to all this?" Jonathan put an arm around her, drawing her close. "I suppose that sometimes the most important harmonies in our lives begin with the simplest of notes," he said. "I do," Jonathan stated as he watched the scene as easily as a bystander. As the invincible unit of a small family brought together by fate and forged by choice, he knew their story was far from over. There would be more obstacles, more opportunities for growth, more music to create. But together they were prepared for whatever symphony life brought them to next. 1 year to the day after that fateful birthday party had changed everything. Jonathan, Lucy, and Max found themselves once again together on the stage of Carnegie Hall. But this time they weren't there to play. Instead, they were just addressing a packed house of music industry leaders, educators, and young musicians. "A year ago," Jonathan began, "I thought I knew what success was going to look like. I assumed it was about riches, power, and self-advancement. But thanks to her and her brilliance of a boy, I learned that success isn't about working hard and making money. Success is about the lives you touch and the good you bring into the world. Lucy took a step forward, her eyes sparkling. We are here not as individuals today, but representing a movement to make music education accessible to all. To develop talent in sustainable and ethical ways and apply the strength of music to unite and mend rifts. Max, now more settled in front of the camera but for all the wrong reasons, went last. The life lessons my musical journey imparted were that music is not about performance or perfection. It's about expression, connection, and joy. Every child should have the opportunity to feel like that, no matter where they come from or what their situation may be. As they finished their speech, declaring a national initiative to bring music education into at-risk communities, applause thundered through the hall. The standing ovation was more than anything for them. It was for the dream they represented, a dream of a world where the arts and commerce could coexist ethically, where talent could be cultivated with heart, and where music could be a force for good. In that moment, while the applause poured over them, Jonathan, Lucy, and Max understood that their makeshift family, born in the crucible of chance and choice, had become something larger than the three of them. They were a symphony of hope, their separate melodies coalescing together in a tremendous harmony.